for joining us today. For those of you who are first-time attendees, the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium is a forum that's sponsored by the Center for Interdisciplinarity and the College of Arts and Letters that features presentations on interdisciplinary projects that foreground the humanities or the arts. This is a series that meets every other week in the fall and the spring. The next presentation, for instance, will be on the 15th of March, so in 2 weeks, in this room from 12 to 1. Helen Zoe Veit, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History, will deliver a presentation entitled Crisco and Confidence, Marketing Ignorance About Processed Food. So that'll be 2 weeks from today in here. After this session, as is true of all the sessions that we sponsor, there will be a coffee hour that the Center for Interdisciplinarity hosts back in South Kedzie Hall in South Kedzie 523. And you're all welcome to join us there if you'd like. There'll be coffee and sweets available and opportunity to just talk about whatever. It's pretty informal, but you're all welcome to join us if you'd like. Today we're thrilled to have with us TAMARA T. Butler, who is Assistant Professor of Critical Literacies in the Department of English and the African American and African Studies program here at Michigan State. Her research includes 20th and 21st century Black women's narratives, Black girl literacies, and Black women's activism connected to the land and the environment. Her work can be found in the Review of Research and Education, Equity and Excellence in Education, English Education, and Theory into Practice. She is a Woodrow Wilson Foundation Fellowship recipient and a member of the National Council of Teachers of English's Standing Committee on Research. She is also a co-organizer and contributor to the Women of Color initiatives at Michigan State, which is responsible for organizing conversations and workshops around women of color creatives. Today she's with us to deliver a presentation entitled Roots and Rupture to teach a Black land, literacies, and placemaking. Dr. Butler.
Thank you. How are we doing today? Good. All right, so today is going to be a two-part. So the first part of the presentation will be a little bit about my work, and then the second part, you'll see. So in their 2016 piece on Reaching to Offer, Reaching to Accept, Allison Guest, Misty Getz-Smith, and Eve Tuck open with the assertion that from our vantage points, land is a Black co-conspiring eternal ancestor, supporting life and freedom. At the same time, in the Black or African diaspora, Indigenous people make ancestral sovereign relationships to that self-same land. As we enter a conversation about Black lives and about Black ways of being, we want to start with a reflection on what are our responsibilities as we live, work, and build on self-same land. In offering land acknowledgements, we are making an outwardly commitment to respect the desire to recognize the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary land stewards of the land. As Dylan Miner, Associate Professor and Director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies writes, these acknowledgements, however, must be preceded by relationships with living Indigenous people, communities, and nations. This declaration must then be followed with ongoing commitments to these same communities. Land acknowledgements are a responsibility. One such manifestation of this responsibility is to engage with those who are thinking about and writing about intentionally our relations, especially the relationships between Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. For Christy Dotson, our Associate Professor of Black Feminist Epistemologies here at Michigan State, in thinking about our identity politics and what it means to be who we are in settler, native, slave triad, will push us to consider, quote, the kind of coalitions and collaborations on self-same land that are needed for decolonial futures in this space, which becomes more clear and complex when we ourselves are more clear on our relations and relationships to settler colonialism in the USA. Therefore, we collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, three fires of confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi people. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations. for historic indigenous communities here in Michigan, for indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous people. Today, I hope that we walk away thinking about our relationships and responsibilities to one another and our own relationships to land. So with that, I begin with a rumination on maps. According to a map within the University Archive, Anishinaabe maintained an Indian encampment south of the Red Cedar River when classes were first held at the university, then known as Michigan Agricultural College, May 13, 1857. We'll get it right. Oh, hello. Getting alerts, all kinds of stuff is happening today. Hey, it's fine. Sorry about that. There'll be more of those. I'm pretty confident. Maps offer us part of a story. They are records of establishment and movement, encampment and emplacement. They do not always tell us what people do or did to maintain a space, make place. Some maps cannot track embodied knowledge, such as the knowledge that Lorette Savoy reminds us of. There we go. Each of us is to a landscape inscribed by memory and loss. So I don't know if you can really see the photographs, but from left to right, left is me and my best friend from birth. So this is us in my front yard. The next photograph is my great-grandmother, Ali Michael Bunno. The photograph next to that is my grandmother's oldest sister. So that's her oldest sister, and the twins in that frame. So it's Mary Williams, and then the bottom is Martha Williams. Mary Williams just passed last year. She lived to be 108. And then in the next photo is my mother, me, and my grandmother. And then the last one is the photo of me also standing on a different side of our yard. And interestingly enough, I think most of these are like Easter photos of myself. So the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands have been understood, imagined, and discussed as a land of hauntings, an archipelago of hexes and healings carried out by black haints, hags, and healers. The Sea Islands have also been and continue to be understood, imagined, discussed as a vast blank slate for development. For this book project, Rooted Literacies, I revisit Johns Island to think about different kinds of maps, map making, and placemaking. I live among other women's papers. I find joy in turning of pages, the careful handling of photographs, conversations between my grandmother and I about ancestors lingering in and around our home. The obituaries in her nightstand drawers, tucked in Ziploc bags, on the kitchen counter, and the ones that hold space between her bills and bank statements. So what you have here is one of the things that from my grandmother's collection of papers. So on your left is a photograph of the property that my family lives on. So this is kind of like the surveyor's map. And then the map on the right is a Google shot that my uncle uses a lot. My uncle is into Google Maps and very excited about the satellite mapping, where you can actually see development happening. So this kind of like area back here is being turned into like a housing complex, but it's right beyond where the road kind of ends. So if you go to like where the orange line is, that's all paved. And then beyond that is a kind of like a dirt road. And so the area in orange is the same area that's here on the left. So it's where my family lives. It's also a community that some of the women that I interview are talking about throughout their, interviews. So in this chapter, so what I'm gonna walk through with you all today is maybe a couple of the different chapters. It's a book project. As of now, there are 5 chapters that are thinking about how Black women are making place and space on Johns Island and the kind of storytelling and placemaking practices that they engage in on these islands or on this particular island. So in this chapter, in the first chapter, I turn to my mother's collection for insight into how we can and why we should look into these different constructions of Johns Island. Through her assorted items related to Black history and cultures, including books, articles, programs, calendars, we can hear and see the stories, the people, and the lived realities of Black families living on Johns Island, a South Carolina Sea Island community. Her collection highlights how Black women on Johns Island are root workers, root gatherers, or individuals who tend to the artifacts, stories, what I'm calling roots that connect Black families to this island community. Their commitments to acquiring and preserving these artifacts speak to larger efforts to help Black families maintain their connections to one another, and as a result, the island. This chapter is made possible by Yomaira Figueroa, who made my mother's collection clearer to me. Through her work on archives, I learned to think about what archives are available to me and to think about Black women's lives, especially those that center, especially those on the South Carolina Sea Islands. Yomaira introduced me to Maria Cotera's work, which centers her mother's collections and materials that documented moments in the Chicana feminism movement. Cotera calls us to take seriously the piles of papers, stacks of books, the stuffed trunks and boxes, suitcases, and dresser drawers of women of color. Her work also recounts using the materials to initiate a larger digital archive of her mother's libraries. For me, I turn to three very important pieces of my mother's collection. So on the top left is my mother's hands going through photographs. So if anybody's watched the College of Arts and Letters Dean's Report, that was done so beautifully by Pete Johnston. This is one of his frames of my mother going through a series of black and white photos that they took of an old Presbyterian church, one of the first Black Presbyterian churches on the island. The bottom is a collection of books that my mother has had over the years and acquired, and that I kind of borrowed. And then this frame over here to the right is a collection of papers, and also a message, is a collection of papers from her own, like this red folder, and it's family reunion photographs, family reunion programs, newspaper clippings, all kinds of things that really have to do with Johns Island. So for me, my first encounter with Black women creatives' imaginings of the Sea Islands was not through Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust. My first encounter was with the spine of Gloria Naylor's Mama Day, peeking out amid my mother's collections of hymnals, Bibles, study books, and Black women's fiction. Naylor and Dash marked the end of an era of Black women's creative writing about and imagining the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands, something I was deeply unaware of prior to starting this project. Throughout writing this book, colleagues and presentation attendees would ask if I read Naylor's novel or knew about Dash's film, and it was through those conversations that Naylor and Dash became inquiry artifacts for me that led me to Black women creatives' work that centralized the Sea Islands or placed them in conversation with other islands. I have a section in the book where I am thinking about four women's books. So I start with Gloria Naylor, and then I use it to kind of dig down and figure out who else published prior to Naylor, but how it can lead us in different directions. So if you've ever read or know anything about Mama Day, it's about Willow Springs, which is an island off the Georgia Sea Island coast that does not belong to either state. They function as a semi-autonomous Black community. So this kind of fictionalized place, and so being able to drill down into publications that centralize the Sea Islands, it leads us to the work of Polly Marshall, the work of Ntozake Shange, who writes specifically about Charleston, and a daughter who goes to Dafuski Island. And then it also leads us to the work of Alice Childress, who is a playwright whose 1970s play actually focuses and centers Johns Island. So being able to work backward, I believe that it helps us move the conversation closer to the South Carolina Sea Islands. So from this imaginary island to these very specific islands and Caribbean islands, and then to Johns Island. So for me, I say collectively, the creatives offer us what I call root working methodologies, or the practices of finding, following, and sustaining, maintaining artifacts and stories connected to Black land. In each context, the root working women, so there's mostly grandmothers, mothers, daughters, they emerge as individuals, according to Cooper, who have the ability to see the past and the future, the dead and the living, and harvest the wisdom that sight cultivates in order to save their descendants, end quote. So one of the books that also comes up out of my mother's collection is the bottom one here, Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life. Through tracking Black women's stories and Guy and Candy Carowin's Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life, I listen as the featured Black women as the story, they emerge as historians and change agents. The women provide insights into the intimacies of Johns Island histories so that visitors, viewers, listeners come to see and hear the island as a self-sufficient community. The book titles, there's a book missing here, so there's also a book, When Roots Die. that was written by Patricia Jones Jackson. So I put those in conversation with Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life to think about the idea of roots and trees, and how they also put forth a call for the reassessment of local publications, newspapers and programs for additional stories told about Johns Island families beyond the research and publications of the 60s and the 80s. Some of the research and publications overlap with the lives of the Black women storytellers who are in this particular project. There are 8 women who I interview over the course of about 3 years. And so just thinking about how their conversations overlap and tell possibly different stories about a different side of the island. This allows us to take an account of what the storytellers, according to Ms. Jenkins in the book Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life, what they put aside for safekeeping for others who will be coming along, end quote. So this red folder is my third kind of artifact from my mother's collection. For months, I've been eyeing my mother's collections of things. I have seen these items before: family reunion programs, newspaper, local church histories, Xerox copies of documents about Gullah Geechee people living on the Sea Islands. Tracking trees and roots in her archives through the title of books written about Black Johns Islanders and the visual aesthetics of Black families. So these are 2 family reunion programs. They're about 4, no, they're more than that because they're biennial. So from the fourth family reunion and the second, the covers contain oak trees. And then there's also thinking about a family reunion t-shirt that used to contain palm trees. And as they continued thinking, as the family continued having reunions, you started to see the palm tree disappear and this oak tree appear across all of the different t-shirts. And so it's the Days families here, the Bunno family is also represented, and then one of the women who I talked to is part of the Simmons family. And so this emergence of trees across a place that is actually known for its oak trees covering the roads. So in positioning my mother's collections as roots or primary resources and artifacts that document how people are connecting to one another and the island, then this becomes, for me, a root working project. And my mother and I emerge as root working women. So trying to think around this idea of conjure, which usually people are thinking about root in that kind of way and healing. But I'm also thinking about the fact that most of the women I interview are either root working in the sense that they were farmers at some point or worked in fields. And then also one of the women talks about her own mother, or her great-grandmother, who was actually the medicine woman in the community. So these different kind of conversations around roots. So that's a little bit about chapter 1. And it really is centering my mom and how my mom helped me think through this project. The next 2 chapters from the book are really interested in storytelling practices. So chapter 2, it's thinking about the stories from Josephine Robinson, who is pictured here on the left, and that's the photograph of Miss Phoebe Taylor, her great-grandmother, who was the medicine woman on Johns Island, and she tells a variety of stories, but the thing I love about Miss Josephine Robinson's stories is her t-shirt. So the beginning of the chapter is, I want this to be a part of my story, so we wrap up like a 30-minute conversation. And just when we were about to walk away and I'm packing up my stuff, Ms. Robinson said, she was like, wait, I want this to be a part of my story. At this point, I'm like fumbling with the camera. And she starts to narrate that the t-shirt she's wearing, which is a family reunion t-shirt, contains 2 different generations. So there's an older man kind of in one corner and then a baby or an infant in the other corner. And so at the time, it represented the youngest and the oldest living relative at the time of the reunion. And also the thing that she wanted me to know is that it was created by a blind man. So this very intricate design, telling a story across generations, done by someone who could not see, but was still able to produce this image. So, and what I also thought was awesome was that Ms. Robinson always wears t-shirts, which I write about. She wears t-shirts that document different parts of her life. So at any given moment, you will walk in the house and she's either has on her grandchildren's school t-shirt, she has on a family reunion t-shirt, she's part of the Eastern Stars, the Order of the Eastern Stars, she has that t-shirt on, or something from her church events. But I guarantee you, she will always be in a t-shirt that represents some aspect of her life. And so I use that also because one of the things that comes out of our conversation is at her kitchen table is where we start our conversation, it's also where we end our conversation. And the kitchen table also emerges throughout her talk, as that's where when she talks about growing up, her and her sister slept in the kitchen on a cot in a 3-bedroom home. So thinking about how the kitchen then plays out in her own life work. And then the kitchen becomes an opening for me because that's why I do most of the interviews that do not happen at a church. So the bottom frame is Miss Rose Blygen, who is part of the Senior Citizens program on Johns Island, the Heber and St. Francis Center. And so she talked to me a little bit. When we started filming, they were like, we need something on this wall. And so they told me to put this quilt up, and we sat down and had this long conversation. But after that, she also invited me to her house. So we are having conversations at her kitchen table. The top frame is Miss Mary Jenkins, who invited me into her home, and this is her granddaughter that she's babysitting at the time that I'm doing the interview. So Madison is like underneath the kitchen table throughout the interview, and at the end I was like, well, can I get a photograph? And Madison pops up from under the table and jumps in the photo with her granny. And so just kind of thinking about how the kitchen table becomes this organizing space, or has always been, but specifically in the stories that women are telling me, most of our storytelling happens at their kitchen. I walk in, I'm like, hi, how are you doing? Where can we talk? And they're just like, just have a seat right there. And instead of moving to any other part of the house, Josephine Robinson chooses to move to her living room because that's where the photographs are. But the rest of the women, when I'm in their homes, were usually at their kitchen table. So that's chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 3 really helps us think about sites of memory. So the kitchen table is where they kind of lay out, metaphorically, a map for me. So we go through various conversations where we talk about the used to be is what Mary Jenkins uses a lot. So she would say, well, you know where Mr. Willie's house used to be, or you know where such and such used to live, or you know where this used to stand. And for me, I felt like that was a cue for us to literally sit like at a map table. And she was constantly she was like, well, which map are we working with if I'm going to tell this story? And so through that, they helped me understand various amounts of placemaking. So throughout their storytelling, they bring up a church, they bring up a store that's no longer there that everybody went to before they went to church. They bring up the houses that their grandmothers used to work in, and how that also became an entry point for them. So they would come in after school, have something to eat, and then they would all walk home after work. So just kind of showing us places that we normally don't see. But of course, with every form of storytelling, not all stories are meant to be told. So chapter 4 is about refusals. And so one of the women that I interviewed, I wanted to ask her specifically about growing up on Johns Island. And she summed up an 18-year span of time as, well, I was a poor Black girl who grew up on Johns Island, but now, or I was a poor Black girl that grew up on Johns Island, but then I moved away and went to Florida. So she doesn't talk much about what life was like for her on Johns Island. And so I asked the question about refusal, which then ties me a little bit into the photograph to the right. So the photograph to the right is Miss Janie Hunter, who is a storyteller, or was a storyteller on Johns Island. And this is from Ain't You Got a Right to the Tree of Life. So people the Carowinds came to the Sea Islands in the 60s because of all of the people in this picture and more. They're called the Moving Star Hall Singers. Most people may know them for their kind of like gospel, they're like gospel, spiritual singing, not a lot of instrumentation, just feet tapping on the floor, hands clapping. And so for them, they went around and they were recorded, and a lot of ethnomusicologists used their work and folklorists used their work. But Miss Janie Hunter was also a storyteller. And not in the sense that she talked about her life, but in the sense that she told Gullah stories or fables or parables in that kind of fashion. But one thing that she says is that I thought was so beautiful. She says, well, maybe one of the things that there's so much knowledge on this island, but the old folks don't want to talk about it because they don't feel as though it's important. And so so I stumbled across this passage where she says, maybe the future will bring back the past. And so that's how I end the book, is with these ideas of that there are so many women who could be in chapter 4 who don't want to tell their story because they don't feel as though it's important. But also Black women who just feel as though, well, I mean, something might have happened and I don't really think that that's important to share. It casts a very different story of this place. But I love Ms. Hunter's work because, that quote, maybe the future will bring back the past, because it opens up a conversation about implications. So chapter 5 is also about what do we do? So moving towards what I'm calling a praxis of Black feminist archipelagics. So the ways in which Black women we can use their island knowledge to teach. And so, of course, I close the book with a turn towards enacting theory. Therefore, I offer 3 components of a Black feminist archeologic praxis, which considers how we can engage in interdisciplinary, cross-intergenerational discussions about Black feminist placemaking. And because I'm also in education, or I'm in English education, this part of the presentation is actually about pedagogy. So this is a logo t-shirt. I'm big on trying different textiles. And so this one is an applique that I made, and I tried to transform it into my own Black Girl Land Project logo. So I'm gonna ask a question of you all. What do you see? What do people see? Mm-hmm. Obscure faces? Okay.
Some faces are hidden.
Mm-hmm. So I use these texts, and I ask people, are these images that you've seen before? Have you ever seen any images like these before? So it was the images, it was specifically the work of Zavaria Simmons, who's in the middle, who got me to thinking about how to talk about it in class form. So I thought about the fact that when we think about landscapes, I know that Carolyn Finney writes about black faces, white spaces. Not Carolyn Finney, is that right? For all my, no? Okay. So I use that because I think about the fact that we don't really think about Black people in landscapes, in nature, beyond labor. And so I use these as usually as artifacts in my courses, but I also use them in designing my flyers. So the picture on the left is from Brian Stanchell, which is he has a whole piece called The Man Who Loved Flowers, and you can actually follow him on Instagram and Twitter. Zavaria Simmons does not have a social media presence, but her photographs are beautiful whenever you can stumble across them. And she also does landscapes of words. And then Zanelli Maholi is a transgender activist in South Africa who uses her photography to think through the ideas of placemaking. And I think about a couple months ago, her work was actually on display at Spelman. And so I asked the question of what do you see? And so like I said, I use them as artifacts for my classes. So with that, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the course I teach. So these are all images from the classes. So I started the class in 2017. It is an African American and African Studies class called the Black Girl Land Project, which is interested in Black, Indigenous, people of color, women of color theories, feminisms that actually help us think about nature, land, and engagement with one another. So there are photographs of students when we went to the Broad when the Beyond Streaming was about Flint was installed. It was also, we went to the Allen Neighborhood Market in a future class to go to a farmer's market. Some of my students didn't know the farmer's market was there. We went to the archives to talk about the life of Myrtle Craig Mowbray, who was the first African-American woman to graduate from Michigan State, and how she shows up very interestingly in a photograph outside with her classmates. And so, but it took a lot of work to figure out that it was actually her face, because she's not documented really much anywhere else in the archives. And then the top one is a project that was created by one of my students. So I will tell you a little bit about 2 of the classes. So when I first started, I'm all up in people's business today. So when I first started the class, it was in 2017. And I started it with about 17 students, and we did a variety of things. So one of the things that I try to do is I believe that the Black Girl Land Project, it has to pay homage to the woman who started the Black Land Project, and that's Misty Getz Smith. So my students had a Skype conversation with her about how she started to do interviews across the country to understand Black people's relationship to land. And then there was a phone conversation with her where she said she was not going to be able to make it to South Carolina anytime soon. So I was like, great. I'll just get that started for you. And so in doing that, one of the things that she has opened up for me is that I invited her to Skype in with my students. I also had a Skype I had a Skype conversation with Natasha Woods at the top, the first African-American woman to graduate with a PhD in ecology, evolution, and organismal biology. And that was like 2 years before she talked with us. And then down here is Taya Miles, distinguished professor once at at University of Michigan, now at Harvard, Princeton, Harvard. And then Lorette Savoy, whose work I quoted at the beginning. So it was through a partnership with Taya and the Department of Afro-American Studies at University of Michigan that my students got to travel to U of M for a day-long retreat, where all we did was talk about what are Black women's relationships to land and what do we call it. A person I am also deeply indebted to is Shakara Tyler, who is a doctoral student in agriculture. She came to the class with actual plants, and she also is doing work around seed keeping and eco-womanism and ideas around what does it mean to be Black and engaging with land. And then my final part that I thought was beautiful was my students. I had an honor student in the class, Miracle Chapman, who is, I think she is executive member of Black Student Alliance Association, Black Student? Alliance, thank you. I was confusing it with something else. And so she brought her a student. She works with a group called Crowning Young Queens. She's also at the time was an honor student. She's like, I want to do a project and I also want to bring my students to campus. Do you mind if? And what in her do you mind if is that she brought her students and my students developed workshops for the students, for the high school students to then participate. And so in that, the students went to 2 or 3 different workshops to learn about natural hair care products as a way of them connecting to land, as well as another group had them think about music, poetry, and then create kind of seed bombs to think about how you can distribute and kind of plant seeds wherever you are. So we're still talking about the science in that. And then I have 2 lovely representatives who took the class last semester. And I would actually invite them to talk a little bit more about their experiences, but I will preface it with this. So in this class, we added folks. So we had doctoral students from the Department of English, as well as from Department of Fishery and Wildlife talk with my students. Someone from the Department of Health Equity, the Director of Health Equity in Virginia, the Executive Director of the Land Loss Prevention Project in North Carolina, and then a professor of environmental education at Denison University. All spoke with my students to help us think differently about land and Black women's relationships to land. And then we went to the Allen Neighborhood Center, and we also went to Detroit. So with that, I will actually turn it over to, I will turn it over to 2 of our folks, or maybe even 3, to talk a little bit about what is it that they might have gained from the course, what were their favorite parts of the course, and why you should even think about these things. So I have Trinity Watson and Imani Cole. If you wanted to share any of your reflections. Yeah, I know, I just threw y'all up there. No? Sure, you can stand up.
Oh, not stand.
Oh, okay, well, there you go.
Hi, I'm Trinity Watson. Last year?
Yeah, I know, right?
So last year I took Dr. Butler's course. I think essentially what was so grand for me, with the class experience, was just centralizing how, my body is an embodiment of the land, because that's something, a connection I never really thought of before. And what I really liked about Dr. Butler's trajectory was that she really instilled that the course was based on the learning that you wanted to have. So I think the first day the question was what do you want to get out of this course, and how do you want that to be articulated? And that was something a professor, I've never had a professor ask me those type of critical questions. Could you use that? Oh yes. Okay. It doesn't amplify. Oh, okay. So yeah, I think that was something that really stuck with me. And certain concepts that I really got out of the course was just further understanding indigenous ideologies that I never came upon, understanding land as first teacher, and also just developing how freedom can exist as a place, and how yeah, it's just things I've never really contextualized before prior to taking her course. And I think Dr. Butler's constant efforts to unite Black women and hear different stories and experiences also just re-amplified my understanding of Black womanhood, but then also its place within land and how they coexist and how they're kind of tied. So all these different concepts are something I really never thought about until my introduction to the course and to Dr. Butler herself. So, yeah.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Imani Cole, and Yeah, so just like Trinity said, Dr. Butler, I feel like I've taken 2 of her classes, but I really like the structure in which she teaches because, like Trinity said, it's very much what you want to get out of the class. And this was my first AAAS course, and I didn't know what I wanted to get. Like, when she asked us that, I was like, I don't know, what do you want me to get out of this class? Because and then just like thinking about, and then she's like, okay, well, it's about Black womanhood and how it relates to land. And I just could not find the connection in that at all. Like, it just didn't make sense to me. So I think, but I was having a great time. Like, she introduced me to a lot of Black women writers and and academics that kind of like pushed my knowledge to think about and consider different aspects and different viewpoints that I wouldn't have previously thought existed and links between the two. So I was having a great time. Like, I'm reading Audre Lorde, and eventually toward the end of the semester, it started to click a lot. And I think it was like her personal connection, and I was able to relate to that because I have family that's from South Carolina as well, and thinking about like the land that we have in South Carolina and why do we have that land, and also just thinking about like our bodies. And I think it was the Dr. Dylan Miner that we saw, and then he spoke a little bit about in how in Native ideology, how it is like your ancestors do not pass, they exist through you, and there's like a link of the past through the future, and you kind of just bring all that knowledge forward. So thinking about like how can I connect what I'm learning in this class to my own family history, and it made me understand a lot more and think a lot deeper about everything. And I'm so glad because it's kind of changed my aspect on Black studies.
Okay. So so thank you both. We also had a guest speaker who is on the front row, but she's not gonna talk. It's Brianna Jones. So I thought oh, okay. Did you want to say something? Okay. Well, one of the things so while she gets the peanut butter situation lined up, that I think is when Imani mentioned Audre Lorde, it was in talking with Brianna that I really appreciated the idea that one of the things that we don't do is we don't talk about how we can use the humanities to really have real conversations about science and about land and about relationship. And so I invited Brianna to do her thing, which is what she does best in exploring the work of Audre Lorde. Do you want to?
Hi, everyone. So I'll say pedagogically, the presentation that, the presentation that I constructed really reminded me of the importance of land in Audre Lorde's work. If you read many of her poems that deal with eroticism, the body is sort of connected to land almost always. So I think that Dr. Butler's class pushed me to discover deeper connections between land and Audre Lorde's work. But I'll say professionally, one thing I really appreciate about Dr. Butler is her support of women of color coming into the academy. And I think you become a woman of color in the academy. And I think by asking us to practice who we want to be in her courses, I think has really been central to my growth as a woman of color, as a student, and as a scholar. So I think more folks should do that, but I thank you for being one of the first to do it.
Oh,
So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up here and cry. And that's a perfect place to end. And so one of the things is, so this is the flyer for the current course. We are working with, once again, people here on campus. So Asia Doughton is a new professor in urban forestry who came in and gave a talk. We also had Jessica Richardson, who is in philosophy, came in and spoke with my students recently about her work. And then we will talk with Kaisha Wilcox, who is also in geography, will come in and speak with my students. So we're trying to keep it a little local, but we want to branch out and have conversations with people that are coming to campus and people who are coming to Michigan. So Myra Santos Febres will be here with Women of Color Initiatives. Dara Cooper will be at University of Michigan. So my hope is that we would continue to have these conversations. Leah Penniman will also be in Detroit. So we're just trying to gather up our folks and get them there. But I think it's a beautiful place to end with, once again, with the words of Christy Dotson, who reminded us that when we ourselves are more clear on our relations and relationships to settler colonialism in the USA, the kinds of coalitions and collaborations on self-same land that are needed for decolonial futures in this space becomes more clear. Thank you. Yay!
So we'll take questions, but just if you don't mind using the microphone that doesn't actually amplify your voice when you ask the question, that would be great, just so that when we process the recording, your voice will be recorded. So questions for Dr. Butler?
Thank you. Thank you for the amazing talk. I really enjoyed that. I have two questions. The first is just a question of terminology. I kind of missed, I think, the definition of self-same land, and I was wondering if you might be willing to just talk about that a little bit more. And then the second question has to do with concerns about the future of maybe potentially low-lying island areas and global warming and sea level rise.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about, how people are talking about that, who live, for example, on John's Island or in the Sea Islands, and how they think about the future maybe of sort of the ecological future of the place, perhaps also in relationship to the roots working that they're doing.
Mm-hmm. So self-same land is not my term. It's actually a term that comes from a variety of scholars, but mostly indigenous scholars and scholars of color. So they're just thinking about the idea of what does it mean to live, to share land. So that's my broad understanding of self-same land, is this kind of shared space that people are on. And so I think it's also complicating our relationship to one another and land. So what does it mean to be set up in the native settler triad of self-same? So we're all in this place together, but what does it mean if we have these different relationships to it? And it's used a variety of ways, but that's the one that I'm going with Dotson, because I think she's really helped me think about what does it mean to be a Black woman living on this land. But I could also give you some more folks who have used self-same. And then to think about ecology, the one thing that's coming up is thinking about development. So just over the summer, there was a small group of folks who were meeting to talk about how developers, that people weren't really thinking about trees and land until someone brought up the photo of an oak tree that had been boxed in. And they were saying that while people think they're preserving this tree, they're actually killing it because it needs space. And so as a result of that, there's that, and then the moving of dirt. So the higher parts of the island, people are taking this dirt, clay, and moving it to the outskirts of the island so that they can build housing developments. And what it's doing is, of course, we know if the land at the top and the other parts of the island is a little bit less impervious. There's a different word for it than that. But so as a result of that, they're taking all this land that that's not permeable, putting it on the outside, and they're causing plugs all over the island. And now they're actually making the flooding worse. And so now people are like, oh, what do we do? And at the time, Sea Islanders, John's Islanders were like, something's not right about what y'all are doing, and you need to stop. And they were like, no, it's fine. And then eventually people who have moved into the subdivisions are experiencing foundation issues. And now it's getting attention, because what people are concerned about is that the person who loses the most are the people who are that were once deemed as the enemy, like the gentrifiers. But there are folks who are moving into these homes, and there's no one that they can actually sue or blame when the house is built and now you have foundation issues or you have flooding issues. There's no one you can call. And the other thing is that they're finding that some of the developers have lied about the maps. So the city map might look very different than the national, the NOAA, like oceanic organization. Their maps are very different. And so people are like, well, who has the correct map of the sea level of this place? And so it's partially global warming, and then it's global warming plus people fooling around with dirt and causing plugs across the island. So yeah.
Thank you for the amazing talk. My question is, you mentioned something about the root work in placemaking. Do you see any connection, or do you work with any connection between root working and memory making, and maybe placemaking in association with that?
That's a good question. I use it a little. So I think about sites of memory, really playing around with Toni Morrison's Rememory. So there's something about the root working and kind of piecing together these different parts of their lives and their archives to build memories. And so I see it mostly in the ways that that when I talk with one woman, for example, Miss Elvinia's store, I have no idea where the store used to be. People have tried to give me so many verbal maps, but they all converge in this place. And I'm like, well, where is this place? Like physically, can I drive by it and like take a picture of the land? And so there's like a memory making in the sense that they're like conjuring up this place that in the minds of anybody my age and younger can't see. And so that's like one thing. The other thing that in terms of memory making is my great-grandmother is the person who kind of also triggered this project, because I realized that so many people, one day there was a young man on a tractor, like a middle-aged man on a tractor, and my mom was like, yeah, we know him. And I was like, y'all know this random white man on this tractor? And they were like, yeah, Ali Bunno was responsible for raising them. And so we grew up with that family. And so in those conversations, I was like, oh, I have all these memories about my great-grandmother, but also a memory that I've never heard of, which is that my great-grandmother used to walk through the neighborhood, this dirt road, and like gather up the children and walk them to school every morning. And so any of the women who lived in Mullet Hall who went to the school have memories of Ali Bunno like walking around. And my brother's favorite thing to say, because the school they went to was Promised Land, and so she was like, so his thing is Ali Bunno led the kids to the Promised Land. Like it's his thing. And I'm like, that's not a story anybody ever has told us in all the years that we've known her and people talk about memory. So there's a memory making in that sense. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bless you.
So if I learned anything from your class, it's about understanding like or having sustained reciprocity and things like that from like what we learned between like in relation with other people. So do you have any plans of creating a potential like Black Girl Land conference, bringing like people from your class like together? Because I think you asked that to us too, like for our final, like what can we do to like sustain this and like look beyond like in a future sense? So do you have any plans towards that?
What a great question. I would love to. I believe that there's either something somewhere in the middle between like fate, serendipity, and like the Holy Spirit, right? Like somewhere in that intersection. Yesterday I just had a conversation with Kyle White, and we talked about the fact that we want to build something together. We want to try to bring people in the same room to have conversations about what people have learned and where people are working. So he's thinking about tribal colleges and communities. I'm thinking about people in the Sea Islands. My students and myself are thinking about people here in Michigan. So collectively, my hope is that there'll be something. And then I'm working on a small project with Professor Doughton and Professor Torres to think about what would it look like to make something that's sustainable, to also bring more people to the table. So it's like, what have students taken, what have other scholars gone on and professionals gone on to do, and what can we come together collectively to talk about? The only issue is money. So so we can sit down and maybe think about getting a larger grant. But for now, we're trying to do something small and bringing together so many different things happening across campus together to just say, okay, we have an artist, we have a scientist, we have a scholar who's somewhere in the middle, and we have people in the community, and we want them all to be in conversation with one another. So that's like a vision down the line, post-tenure. We're gonna go ahead and throw that out there into the world. And so these are things that we're thinking about. So I'll keep you posted.
Thank you.
So my question kind of comes from my experience in class. So I know that we knew of your project, and we got to hear like a lot of the we saw some of the videos, which was really cool, but we knew it very high level. So coming to this talk and getting to see like the full picture is amazing. But also in class, it's a part of this, but we had like a lot more content focused on like building our own understanding of kind of your work, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, how do we relate to like the thought of like Black girls' ties to land? So my first question is, how has like your experience teaching the Black Girl Land Project kind of, and what students bring to the class kind of like changed, or have you learned anything that you would like to add to your project based off of class? And then what did you hope that we really grasped from your project in class? So like kind of that, like where did they kind of overlay? And then also, I know like a large part of the big question of class was like, as Black people, this land isn't ours necessarily, it's indigenous land, but we also didn't ask to be here. So like, and we still have ties to the land. So understanding that, what did you think, whether that be talking to Professor Dylan Minor, like what did you think the most effective way to get that whole understanding across was?
Yeah. So you gave me 3 questions.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm gonna tackle the first one. So I think what students bring to my class shapes it because none of the students come from the same discipline. So it's not like it's a required psychology or whatever course. And so in that particular, this semester has been different because I have a large chunk of students who are from psychology, a few from James Madison, and then I have like a fashion design major. And so I'm like, okay, how do we make this thing work? But what I find is that students come to the class really interested in thinking about ideas of power across the board, or also some of them, because they're psychology majors, of how, because it wasn't until we talked about with Asia Doughton, that they were like, well, if we know that trees do this, like how do we know if they're making communities, how are the trees impacting people's mental health? And I was like, I would have never seen that question, but that's the kind of question. So my thing is I design classes in hopes that whoever I put in front of students will like jog a connection. And so far that seems to work. Like I was like, oh, I would have never thought of that. As well as what students bring to the class also helps me see. So the one thing that it does help me see is if I see students who are super stressed. We've been doing a lot of collage making in my classes. But it also is guided by the fact that we know that women of color have always been making art as a way to think through something, but also as a way to like detach a little from like the stress and try to put all of that on paper or on canvas. And so that's one of the things that I feel like has really shaped my class. And it's also the first time I've had a class with more than what I had 3 male students of color. And every year we've added 1. So for the first year it was 1 male student, second year is 2, and then this year is 3. So I'm like, so that's also been helpful because they're just like, I mean, this class is about Black girls and land. So I'm always like, why are you here? You know, because I understand why women of color come to the class, but why as a Black male student do you find yourself in this class? And how is that helping you think through different things? And so that's been really insightful for me to think about. And it also has helped me change my lens a little, because for a while it's always been women, women, women. But the Brian Stanchel photograph made me think about, well, what do we do with like queer and gender nonconforming people of color? Where do they fit? And then also the work of Zanelli Maholi and how she's thinking about like what does it mean to be trans and also connecting to land. And then what do I hope people will get out of the class? You all said it. It's really thinking about you. One of the very first year I taught this course, a student, we read Savoy's book. And then we had a conversation with Savoy, and I'll never forget her. Her grandmother had passed that year, and I was like, this is gonna be a rough year for people. Like, but she used the class to process the loss of her grandmother and what her grandmother taught her. And there was an excerpt in the book where they talk about footprints and carbon footprints, so we know that's something very different. But she said, through this class, I'm thinking about what is my footprint in terms of my grandmother's footprint was bigger than mine because she was more connected to the land. And the further and further we get away from our connection to land, the smaller and smaller our footprint becomes. And Savoy was like, can I write that down? And, right? And so I was like, that's phenomenal. And so using this idea to just think through, for her, was thinking through what is my connection and what do I do? And so when you walk away, I'm just like, here are all the theories that I can find and people who are working at different parts of land. And I just hope that you walk away with something like, I can actually make this change. I can do this thing. And then also thinking about Indigenous and Black relations, I've been very intentional about trying to bring conversations and scholars to the classroom, materials, exhibits, whatever, to think through that. Because I think Lee Maracle, I think that's how you say her name, she writes specifically, there's like, in I Am Woman, she writes, the land is native, but the labor is Black. But she says, but as a result of that, we make space and welcome in, descendants of Azania and Africa. We invite them in to kind of figure out what we're gonna do with this place. And so that's where I'm hoping that people can start to have these conversations between what is our relationship to land. Did that help?